Thank you all for coming. My name is Greg Salyer. I'm the president of the Philosophical Research Society, and I'm in Manly Hall's office. Still hard to call it my office because it's all manly stuff is in here, especially over my shoulder here. These are his artifacts. And it's his desk. I don't really have much in it because it's his. And we're at the Philosophical Research Society here in Los Feliz, which Manly Hall, of course, founded in 1934. And I have with me tonight our good friend, Mitch Horowitz, who is our lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Research Society. And he's been a friend a long time, and he's done some really important work for us, even before I knew him. If you have the reader's edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages from Penguin, that's Mitch. He did that. If you have The Secret History of America, which is an anthology of Manly Hall's writings on America, Mitch did that. We used to have Mitch out 2 or 3 times a year, pour him full of coffee and pizza and just set him loose. But, those days are gone for the immediate future, I guess. We're not planning on opening in 2021, just so you know. I don't see us opening until not only is there a vaccine, but also a treatment. It's just too dangerous. But here we are online, as we should be. And I've got my friends here and colleagues, Kelly Carmena and Matthew Taylor. They're going to be manning and womaning the chat box and the Q&A and helping us out if you have any issues. All right. So I think Matthew posted the agenda, which is loose, of course. But it's 7:06, so I think we should get started. We're here to celebrate this. And this came about to a typical Mitch way. Some of you may know we were a university up until last year, and then accrediting demands made it impossible for us to continue. So we still offer courses, just without the barriers now. So that's really great. And then Mitch offered the very first course, as it should be, in this new paradigm. This, actually, The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages. And we actually have the videos up for sale of that lecture. But this is the book from that. So this is not just those lectures. This is extra material that is not in the lectures. And we're really happy, and we just love working with Mitch, and we're really happy to have this out because it's a book, Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's a heavy book and hard to enter. And so I think Mitch has created here a nice lobby, a nice entryway into what he calls a labyrinthine book. So Mitch, thank you for being here. We appreciate you.
Pleasure. It's a thrill to work on this material. I think working on the Reader's Guide, working on the original Reader's Edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages back in 2003. It's hard to believe it's been over 17 years now since that book appeared. It was a life-changing experience. I look at it as one of the signature highlights of my work. It set me on my path. So, you know, this great book, Secret Teachings, it changes people's lives. And I'm capable of saying that because it's changed my own, changed the work that I do, the way that I view life, the way that I view myself. And I can't imagine my experience is exceptional. You know, I think it holds that potential for everyone.
Would you talk about this at length in your book, The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings? Would you mind sharing that story here? I love the story because it has a character named Pythia.
Oh, right. It was years ago. It must have been maybe 1999, 2000. I was in New York City, and I was having lunch with a couple of friends. And I was really just at the beginning of my immersion in esoteric studies. And I said to both of them, who should I be reading? And one of them, a woman named Pythia Pei, who was given the initiate's name of Pythia by a great Sufi teacher named Pir Vilayat, who died several years ago. And Pythia, of course, had the same name as the great oracle at Delphi, who Manly talks about in the Secret Teachings. In response to my question, who should I be reading, she said it in this almost dreamy voice, Manly P. Hall, lingering, over every syllable. And the instant that I heard that stately name, I just said to myself, who is that? I have to know who that is. And I have this tendency, and this may be true of some of you who are joining us tonight, I tend to enter into ideas first through a persona. I'll get very gripped by a persona, whether it's G.I. Gurdjieff or Madame H.P. Blavatsky or Alan Watts or Neville Goddard. There's something about a persona that will grab me first. And if I find that that individual has some kind of gravity, then I start to delve into his or her ideas. And I start asking myself, what are they about? Where do they come from? What's their backstory? What did they write? What do they think? What do they have to share? And so I think I immediately got attracted to Manly as an individual. I recognized that this was a person who was born right at the end of the Victorian age, who engaged in a life of scholarship without any of the ordinary guardrails that we possess today. I mean, forget about digital culture. I mean, the great public libraries were only just opening. The resources that were available to the individual, especially a young man like him who was born in rural Canada, grew up in the American West, in the Dakotas, he had no formal schooling available to him, and yet he proved capable of embarking on this really, truly, truly beyond ordinary life of self-education. And so it was when I first discovered him as an individual through Pythia, through our modern day oracle, that I began to enter his ideas. And when I got my first copy of the Secret Teachings, and it was a hardback replica of the original, published by PRS, which PRS continues to publish today, I just fell into it and never looked back. And that's the experience people have with the Secret Teachings. They feel as if they found a lifetime companion, and a companion that constantly discloses surprises to them. So that was how I found my way to Manly Hall.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue, because you seemed primed for the Secret Teachings. You were ready. It was kind of waiting for you. I think that's the usual experience with the Secret Teachings. I think
yes.
You call it in this book, you call it labyrinthine.
Yeah.
So what would you say to people who don't have a Pythia and don't have the background that you had coming into this text? I mean, how do you get in? How do you move through the labyrinth?
Yeah. I always tell people, and this is something I talk about in the Seeker's Guide, that there are some of these books of esoteric wisdom that have a reputation as being unreadable or that seem intimidating. And I really promise you, they're not impenetrable. They can be approached. The writers who produced these books wanted these books to be approached. They wanted audiences. They wanted constituencies. I'm thinking specifically of G.I. Gurdjieff's allegorical epic, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which I've read 3 times. And it's a profoundly complex book, but it is a readable book, and it is an approachable book. And you start to sort of get into its flow and its rhythm, even though it's very alien to what we're familiar with. The Secret Doctrine by Madame Belvansky, her 2-volume encyclopedia arcanum. And it's a profoundly unusual book, a very different book from Gurdjieff, very different book from Manly, but it's a readable book. It is a readable book. Likewise, The Secret Teachings is. It can be very jarring in its original form because there are all these different charts and captions and this infinitesimally small type size and captions that seem to extend for a football field, and you're losing your place. But that was my impetus to create the Reader's Edition back in 2003, because I asked myself, what would happen if you took this text, which can be very intimidating in terms of its layout, and just laid it out in a normal dimension and in a more conventional page design. And as it turns out, once you do that, you discover it's very, very readable. So I encourage people to just dive into the deep end of the pool. Just start turning the pages, and you'll discover you forge your own relationship with the book.
Excellent. Thank you. And of course, this will help too.
That's my wish. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Why are the teachings secret?
That's a wonderful question. One could argue, is any of this secret? Manly has more readers today than he did throughout his entire lifetime. There's myriad copies of the secret teachings. Some of them, frankly, of dubious quality. There's people who pirate stuff and they put it up online, and they're not really paying attention to. They might omit illustrations, for example, that are vital to the text. So but whatever the case, there are myriad editions. I think that, in a sense, I consider something secret in our world if it's been neglected, if it's been unacknowledged. A lot of what appears in the secret teachings of all ages is kind of rejected knowledge, things that we've forgotten about or overlooked, or that we don't take seriously as part of the educational experience. So, for example, we were talking about the Oracle at Delphi, Pythia. When Manly published the Secret Teachings of All Ages in 1928, his description of the Oracle at Delphi at that time was considered fanciful. There were a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists and historians who doubted the existence of the Oracle at Delphi as it was described in the writings of Herodotus. This idea that there was a woman who was seated on top of a golden tripod inside of a cavern or a cave, who imbibed these fumes from a crevice in the earth, grew intoxicated on these fumes, and then recited predictions, prognosticated to people who came to visit her. There were, in the early 20th century, that was considered fanciful. That was considered maybe something that Herodotus had invented or had heard through local folklore. But lo and behold, Manly, drawing upon Greek sources and other Neoplatonic sources, presented that description as fact. And about 10 years after his death in 1990, there were archaeological discoveries at Delphi that found a cavern exactly like the one described in the classical literature, and found within that cavern crevices in which there may have been some kind of decomposing organic matter, probably animals, and fumes were being emitted. And so what had been considered esoteric, rejected, unacknowledged, turned out to be archaeologically correct. So I get really interested in that. Manly dealt with a lot of ideas that were rejected ideas, so he called them secret. He might have also said that they're secret because they're passed from the mouth of the teacher to the ear of the student. They're part of an initiatory tradition, and so little has reached us today in the 21st century of an authentic, antique initiatory tradition. We just have fragments. We have threads. So much got destroyed over time, and so there is a secrecy there. And having lost this knowledge makes it hidden, makes it one step out of reach. And so the person who experiences the secret teachings, has to work all the harder to sort of connect some of these threads, which is one of the things I attempt to do in the Seeker's Guide, because this material is not just delivered to us in some complete form. It's delivered to us in a fragmentary form.
Yeah. Thank you. That answer actually resonates with me because, as you know, I'm academically trained, and Manly was not a fan of folks like me, academically trained philosophers, and for good reason. And so the secret teachings was, in fact, secret to me because throughout my university education, we were not allowed to talk about this stuff or even look at this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
for various reasons, but it was in effect secret to me,
Yes.
right? And it's funny because just the other day I was like, well, I wonder if anybody's written on Manly Hall. And so, I go to a university database and I type in Manly Hall, and there's one article. And actually, the guy who wrote this article just wrote it, and he communicated with me beforehand. And you know what it was about? It was about deconstructing the notion that Osama bin Laden had the secret teachings in his hideout in Pakistan. And I know you've written about this too.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You search for Manly P. Hall in scholarly databases, and you get this one thing about how he was not informing Osama bin Laden. What a strange way for him to come up, right? When in fact he has this corpus of amazing philosophical scholarly.
Right.
And it's interesting that you don't come from academia.
Right.
You're a writer, you're an editor, you're a lecturer, and it was more open to you in a way than it was to me.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, there's so much to unpack there in terms of academia, in our generation, its strengths, its weaknesses. I will just share a small story, which I think is valuable. As you alluded, I mean, until very recently, the name Manly P. Hall was not heard within academia at all. And yet, the religious scholar Jacob Needleman told me a story that when he was a young man in the mid-1960s, he met the great scholar of myth and religion, Mircea Eliade. And Eliade, whose name is not as widely known, perhaps, as, say, Joseph Campbell, did a lot to bring seriousness and recognition to the study of esoteric religious traditions within Western academia. And he was a very widely respected figure. And he confided to Needleman that when he was a young man, it was the secret teachings of all ages that instigated his study of myth and ancient religions. So although he might not have cited Manly as source material, Manly was kind of the software behind his own search. And I think that's been true of certain figures within the scholarly tradition. And I think what we're probably going to find in the immediate years ahead is that Manly will get written about as a subject in a more serious, more complete way, because I would say over the past 15 years or so, there have been a cohort of scholars who have expressed really serious interest in studying esoteric traditions, like Catherine Albanese at UC Santa Cruz, and my friend Jeff Kreipel at Rice University, and April DeConnick at Rice University, who's the chair of their religious studies department, and many other folks besides. And so there is a new cohort or a rising cohort of people within mainstream academia who know Manly Hall, who have heard of Manly Hall. They might not cite the secret teachings as source material, but they would cite him as a subject, as a legitimate subject of historical study, and somebody who can't be written out of the American religious experience. So I think it's something to watch very carefully for. I think in the next several years, we're going to start to see a change in that regard.
Oh, that's really encouraging. I haven't heard you say that before.
Yeah.
Great, yeah. Well, I think of Needleman, whom you mentioned, and I think of Robert Thurman.
Yes.
And I think of Robert Elwood, and I think of Stephen Heller. It's like, it's
right.
almost, you have to have a certain, or you used to have to have a certain, tenure, I think
right.
certain scholarly ethos to work with Manly Hall, because if you're on the tenure track, you can't talk about this stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Kripal is really exciting what he's doing. Stephen Heller, if you don't know, I bet many of you do, is 89 and is writing memoirs. and he says he's almost done with those.
That's brilliant.
Yes. Oh, can you imagine? A man who lived under Nazism and Stalinism, and then
Yes.
the Gnostic Society in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And people may not know this, but for decades it was Manly Hall and Stephen Heller teaching here at PRS and just doing amazing things. So
yes.
I'm really happy to hear you say that you think there's going to be a new at Manly Hall, new scholarly look at Manly Hall.
I really believe that. I was invited to a conference at Rice University a couple of years ago, which was called the Gnostic America Conference, and it was meant to assemble some different people, some independent scholars, some university-based scholars who were exploring esoteric material. And I was really surprised at the range of people from different schools and universities who showed up, who were presenting papers and so forth, and some really very quality people, including, some department chairs or people who held distinguished professorships at various schools, and every single one of them would have known who Manly Hall is, and could have been part of this evening's discussion. And he might not fit within the particular paradigm that they're writing about, but they certainly know who he is. And so I think there are going to be more and more scholarly articles and probably eventually books that recognize Manly. But I think when he died in 1990, he was probably very concerned that his name was not known, and he was probably very fearful that his work would be conscripted to obscurity. And again, I can't say it often enough. There's more people reading The Secret Teachings of All Ages in our generation than there did during Manly's entire lifetime. So his fears didn't come to pass, quite the opposite, and he's becoming more and more known.
Yeah, exactly. And I have data to prove that.
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
We can't keep his books on our shelves. We've already sold out of your book. We
That's
have
great.
coming in Tuesday. I should say that there is a book about Manly Hall you may know. It's called Master of the Mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty well documented, but the whole point of that book is a kind of Hollywood biography.
Yes, right.
It's actually him who suggests in a recent edition of the book that Osama bin Laden was reading Manly Hall, which is patently false and makes no sense. Even if it were true, it would make no sense.
Right. Well, as you alluded, I wrote a short article about that. The CIA released a list of 39 English language books that were found in Osama bin Laden's compound. And there were a number of conspiracy texts, and there was a copy, so we're told, of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was reading it, was influenced by it, and there's a conventional enough reason why it would be found there, in that there are a lot of, in the Middle East as well as in other parts of the world, including our own United States, there are conspiratorial views about Freemasonry and secret societies. And Manly, of course, had what I would call a secret society thesis, that Masonry in particular, but also the Rosicrucian Brotherhood and some other groups, contributed to the founding of the American Republic. And that is true. I mean, the fact is, you had a number of the founders, the framers of the Constitution, signers of the Declaration, Washington's generals. You had an outsized number of those figures who were Freemasons. Freemasonry was a radical expression that came out of the Reformation. It was radically ecumenical. It believed in certain civic ideals that later got framed into the Constitution. It was far from the only source that the framers were operating off of when it came to religious freedom and things like that. But it was a source. It was a source. And when Manly was writing about this material, that thesis, it might have been acknowledged, but it wasn't widely recognized within most works of American history. And again, in more recent decades, the influence of Masonry as a civic and political force is more validly recognized. When Manly was writing about that, it was a little bit more of a point of view that was off to the margins. Now, Flash forward to the modern Middle East and other parts of the world. There's all these sinister ideas about new world orders and deep states and the Illuminati and Freemasons and so forth. And so if you're going to have a handful of books on your bookshelf that take that conspiratorial point of view, you might have a copy of The Secret Teachings, which doesn't take a conspiratorial point of view at all. It just simply tries to map out the fact that there were these connections. But the end user doesn't always understand that. The end user may think, oh, this is some sort of, secret code about, the hidden sinister forces behind the founding of the United States. So these books can be very easily misunderstood. They can travel strange and serpentine paths. And if this list is accurate, then it found its way onto this man's bookshelf. I wouldn't ascribe too much. It's not a sort of momentous find in the sense that, there are a lot of misunderstandings of American history and a lot of people who gravitate towards books either without reading them or without really grasping them.
Yeah, and I think even if he did read it, it would be an esoteric version of Islam that I don't know that he'd even recognize.
I don't think he'd recognize it at all. And a lot of people have books in their bookshelves that they don't read. So let's all keep that in mind,
Fair enough. Well, this gives me the opportunity to say that we are working with a documentary filmmaker to create a film of Manly P. Hall and his work. And unlike the Sahagan book, which is a Hollywood biography, this is going to be about Manly's life and work, contextualized here in Los Angeles, and looking forward to that very much. So we can wait for that to come out. It should be amazing. We've got a lot of other great things going on here that you'll be seeing in the coming months and years. But for now, Mitch, let's talk about The Seeker's Guide. Now, this is not an exhaustive line-by-line commentary of the secret teachings. It would be like the rabbis you use, like
right
forever. What is this book?
Well, it is. I liked your earlier description of it. If I'm remembering it right, it's a kind of lobby to the secret teachings of all ages, and it's a 12-chapter book that examines the backstory of the secret teachings, who Manly Hall was, what we can understand about his intellectual process, how we can understand his ability at such a young age to created this magisterial volume. And then I go through a variety of subject areas that Manly covers in the book, and I try to help readers understand some of the historical background of these areas, some of the developments that have come to light since Manly wrote the book or since Manly's death. For example, we were talking earlier about the archaeological developments 10 years after Manly's death that validated his description of the Oracle at Delphi. Manly was very interested in the question of lost civilizations or a thesis about Atlantis. And the fact is, in the time since Manly wrote the book, we do have some theories that have arisen from independent Egyptologists like John Anthony West and Robert M. Schock, a geologist at BU, that there's water damage on the oldest portion of the Great Sphinx at Giza, and that should be examined as to whether it could reset the timeline of ancient Egypt. Manly maintained that the timeline of ancient Egypt extends back to 10,000 BC versus, roughly 3,500 BC, which is kind of the longstanding traditional inception point of what we consider ancient Egypt. And in fact, the Schock-West thesis holds the same thing that Manly did, that the timeline should be reset to 7,500 or as old as 10,000. This is very controversial, and this is not accepted within mainstream Egyptology, to put it mildly. But I do believe it deserves a hearing. And so I write about that, for example, in connection with the secret teachings. I try to bring some light to some of Manly's subject matter, including mystical Christianity, the nature of Kabbalah, the history of the tarot cards, and in particular, the so-called secret society thesis. What role did Freemasonry and other esoteric thought movements play in the founding of America. And there's real history there. I mean, there's real historicism that can be brought to bear on those questions.
Yeah.
And so I try to create a network of 12 chapters that provide the background to the book, that provide background to some of Manly's most significant subjects, and that also provide the reader with pertinent scholarship, ideas, and developments that have occurred since the book was published, which is now almost a century ago, so obviously there are going to be some developments, or that have occurred since Manly's death in 1990. And there are many subjects that I don't cover. Those that I do cover, I view as kind of the foundational subjects of the secret teachings, the subjects that sort of make up the grid work on which most of the chapters stand. So my hope is that it serves as it's a companion to the book, essentially. Yeah. It's a companion to the book that provides a backstory about Manly, a backstory about his subjects, and updates on some of his most foundational subjects.
Yeah, right. And this is what I've always appreciated about you is you ground things. I don't care what it is, if it's UFOs or Satan or tarot or the Hermetic philosophy, you ground it. And I found that so important in esoteric studies.
Thank you.
It's so easy to fly off,
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much that's speculative out there. And, we as a generation immersed in digital culture have so much information available to us, it's almost confounding. But the fact is, life is not just about quantity, and insight doesn't just arrive in quantity. We have to be able to frame things, lend perspective to things. Apropos of our discussion just now about the secret teachings being on bin Laden's bookshelf, like, don't get sensationalistic about that. Don't get carried away with that. There's, one has to be able to bring perspective to something and say, what's the reason for this? What's the context for this? What are the reference points that we have to help us contextualize this so we don't get carried away with speculation?
Yeah. How do you, and just a couple more questions, then we'll let you all in. How do you view Manly Hall? And I ask that as president of PRS, where people contact us and say, basically, he was a holy man, a guru, but I don't find him ever talking like that or even welcoming that appellation. How do you see himself?
Well, there are two different lenses, I guess, through which I view Manly Hall. One lens is intellectually. I see him as this extraordinary curator of the world's esoteric traditions.
I like that.
And what he performed in the secret teachings was an act of curation on a magisterial scale, and it was beyond the ordinary. I mean, it can't be said often enough how young a man he was when he produced that book. He was just 27 years old. It can't be said often enough how meager the resources were that he would have had access to, compared to what we have at our fingertips today. And his capacity to produce that book, it really was extraordinary. It really went beyond the common reference points. And so it's justifiable that people feel a sense of awe about the man's accomplishment. That said, I agree with your perspective entirely. I do not see Manly as a guru or as some kind of a realized figure or an enlightened figure, frankly, even if there is such a thing, and I have my questions about that. And I think that it's very important not to elevate Manly P. Hall onto some sort of an altar. I don't think sycophancy helps us get any closer to the man. And I think, quite frankly, it's also important to understand, and I make allusions to this in The Seeker's Guide, and make allusions to this in Occult America, or have a chapter on Manly. The man also suffered. The man also had terrible difficulties in life. I think for one thing, peaking when you're very young can be an extremely difficult thing. As extraordinary as a fact that it is that he produced this book when he was 27 years old, you go forward a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades from that, you still have a very long stretch of life ahead of you, and it's very, very hard to find your sense of chapter 2 when chapter 1 was this unbelievable, extraordinary accomplishment. So peaking young can be very difficult. And I think he experienced difficulties towards the end of his life that made him very vulnerable, as I write about, as others have written about. Manly was preyed upon by a team of basically con artists towards the end of his life, who got him to sign over their will to him just a couple of days before his death. There's all kinds of speculation about his death. I don't think he was a victim of homicide, but I do think he was a victim of what we today might call elder abuse. I think he was not treated well by the people immediately around him. I think he was bereft of a circle of people who were capable of protecting him. I do have my questions because I think his intellectual faculties were strong right up until the very end. And I say that because we have recordings of talks Manly gave towards the end of his life, and his intellectual faculties were sharp as ever. At the same time, it's fair to ask, if a person spends his or her entire life studying the wisdom and ethical traditions of religion, of classical philosophy, of different indigenous traditions around the world, why did that wisdom not seem present in a protective way towards the very end? It's a question, or dismiss that question by saying, well, we can't know the motives of a realized man. I don't think that's helpful to the human situation. I think that we can try to draw lessons from the life of Manly, both his extraordinary accomplishments and areas of life where those accomplishments seemed not to rescue him when he was facing certain suffering. If we don't face that, we don't face ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I love this man, and I fall to my knees before the greatness of the work that he did, but I also recognize that he was of the same stuff as the rest of us are, and if we want to know ourselves, we should responsibly and in a measured way try to understand those aspects of his life that we can learn from, both the accomplishments and the difficulties.
As our friend and my predecessor used to say, we don't teach Manly Hall, we teach what Manly Hall taught. And
that's brilliant.
I think it's a great tribute to the man, because
yeah,
my reading of him, he's always pointing outside of himself to existing wisdom. He's not saying he has it, even though he clearly did. He had it all at his fingertips, it seemed like. But yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'll open it up here in a minute, but I did want to ask you, the talk we're having is called The Secret Teachings Today. And this is your answer to what are the secret teachings today, but could you give us a short answer right here? What's the relevance of the secret teachings today? You think, and I agree with you, that he's more relevant than ever, and this book is more relevant than ever, and we're seeing that in our demands for it. What's the message, or the overall message, do you think?
Well, I think that Manly believed that philosophy, above all, had to be practical. He didn't like a kind of scholastic philosophy. He believed, as William James did, who died about 20 years before The Secret Teachings was published, he believed that philosophy had to have an impact on conduct, and that if philosophy didn't have an impact on conduct, something was wrong. Something was wrong with the ideas, or something was wrong with the way the student was receiving them. And he believed very strongly that philosophy should be a daily guide to living. And, how philosophy serves as a daily guide to living is up to the individual. I mean, the path that I take may be different from the path that Manly Hall took. The practicality that I search for within esoteric philosophy may lead me to different conclusions at times, or different waters, than Manly was led to. And we have to understand that too. I think that when we speak in terms of practical philosophy, and the individual's engagement with the great esoteric or philosophical ideas, we cannot predetermine what he or she should find. I mean, we have to be willing to let the individual embark on his or her own path of self-verification. Manly embarked on his path of self-verification, and he came to believe very strong in reciprocity, karma, reincarnation, asceticism, a kind of lifestyle that wasn't geared towards enormous consumption, preservation of the natural environment. I mean, you could say that his principles were very simple and very basic, and yet I would always caution, it's very hard to apply simple things. We hear simple things, don't lie, don't steal, don't disrespect your neighbor, don't be violent. Great, and we all nod our heads in agreement, but when we try to apply those things, we see how difficult it can actually be. And that's where the search begins. Why is that difficult? What is this brokenness in human nature that makes it difficult for us to apply ideas that ought to be very simple, but that prove to be very challenging in application?
Beautiful, beautifully said. We're actually here at PRS are doing a deep dive into Manly's publications, many of which you all haven't seen, so we're going to try to get those out. And one of the things we're discovering is his amazing ability to speak to the moment. So he has one of my favorite essays of his is in Horizons, which is not available, right? And it's called Psychological Advertising, about 1960. And 1960 in advertising, right? That's the Mad Men.
Right.
Yeah, and Manly's right there, and he sees right through it all, and it's brilliant.
How fascinating.
Yeah. So everyone, thank you for listening, and there's a Q&A icon if you open the chat to the far right, but if that's too much, you can just type your questions right in the chat, and Mitch will be happy to answer them or respond. We'd rather do this because the audio can be so uncertain.
It can be overwhelming, yeah. I'm not seeing a chat box. So if you want to interpret for me, feel free.
Yeah, I'll take care of it.
Yeah, thank you. But anybody, jump right in, please. Let's exchange together. Signed copies. That's a logistical question, I guess.
That's a very good.
I wish I could get on a plane and just come out there, but it's not the world we live in. Will there be signed copies available? I'd love to make signed copies available. Maybe Greg and Kelly and Matthew and I can discuss that, and we'll see what we can figure out. I mean, there has to be a way, right?
Yeah, well, that's a great idea. Thank you, Vera.
Yeah,
we could probably.
Thank you. Yeah.
If Mitch ever stops traveling for a day,
right?
Tell everyone where you just were.
I was in the Yucatan in Mexico, and I was visiting some Mayan sites. There are visitors down there. I traveled very carefully, responsibly. I want other people to be safe. I want to be safe. But there are archaeological sites in Mexico that are now open, and they are desirous of visitors. The economy needs visitors, and it can be done responsibly and safely. And so I traveled to Chichen Itza, Coba, Uxmal, a variety of other Mayan sites, and had a chance to participate in some Mayan ceremonies on traditional Mayan land with shamans that trace their lineage very accurately and rightly back to some of the traditional practices and peoples, and it was a very moving experience.
You know the name Mitch Les Plongeons?
Say again?
Les Plongeons?
Yes, of course, yeah. Right. He shows up in The Secret History of America, our collection of Manly's historical writings, yeah.
We have some of their plates from late 19th century.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Photographed in Chichen Itza.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, I see some questions coming up.
Yeah.
Bill, you just asked something. What topics in the secret teachings did I find most intriguing. You know, one of the topics that I found most intriguing was Manly's chapter on Pythagorean mathematics, and I write about that in the Seeker's Guide. You know, sometimes I really wish that when we teach science and mathematics to kids, so vitally important, I think we could add a pinch of history and explain to them the story of some of the pioneers behind some of these ideas who felt that they were, and I think rightly felt that they were, unlocking a kind of code to human life. And so I really loved Manly's chapter on sacred geometry and Pythagorean mathematics. A lot of questions are coming up, and I want to be able to give everybody a chance, but they kind of come and go in a scroll.
Let me take care of that for you.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
here's a good one. What was Manly's take on the dark arts?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Manly was very critical of what he thought of as black magic or the dark arts. He was very critical of what we today might call the prosperity gospel or the more materialistic aspects of New Thought. And, you know, personally, in my own life, I have a philosophical difference with Manly on some of those subjects. I don't make a distinction between so-called white and black magic. I think not only is that culturally outdated, but it doesn't quite get at the wholeness of human nature. I have a different point of view about attachment, non-attachment, inner, outer, personality, essence. I tend to view life as a great whole. I tend to view the pursuits of the individual as sacred, so long as they're ethical, and by ethical I mean respecting the reciprocity of others. So my approach is a little different, but I recognize Manly's approach, and I take Manly's approach very seriously. He was very cautionary about such things.
Very good. Here's another good question. Where did Paul do most of his research when writing or compiling the secret teachings of all ages?
Well, he did some of his research at the New York Public Library here in New York City, where it's kind of funny. I mean, I'm a writer in residence, although I haven't been at the public library since February because it's been closed. So I can go outside and use the internet connection on the front steps, but none of us can enter the library. But I have had the privilege to do a lot of work at the New York Public Library, and Manly did a lot of his writing at the New York Public Library. He gained entree to the British Library. He used the libraries at some of the spiritual organizations in Southern California, Rosicrucian organizations, theosophical societies. He had some benefactors who had private libraries, and those libraries were open to his use. But he writes most colorfully about making a practice of going day after day to the enormous reading room at the New York Public Library, which is a cathedral of its own. And once we're past the lockdown, it's a place that I encourage everybody to visit.
Speaking of places, I'm reminded of another documentary filmmaker who was here this week, to talk about sacred space in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously Manly started working here on the rest of his career and those voluminous writings. And so we've got the Vescent Lodge, Anti-Vescent Lodge, we've got Kona, we've got Self-Realization Fellowship, we've got PRS, all in this area. And there's going to be a film about that, which I think is going to be really cool.
That's wonderful. And also, many people are familiar with the campus of PRS, and of course, the lockdown ends a date that none of us know, but it's so worth visiting the campus because it's a small space, and yet it's also an epic space. And we were talking about the Mayan sites. PRS was constructed at a time when so many archaeological discoveries of Mayan sites were made, and the design principles of the Mayan monuments are incorporated into the campus. And the campus, the PRS campus, it's a mixture, it's a pastiche of Egyptian, Mayan, Art Deco design, and there's just not a space like it anywhere I've seen in the world. It's absolutely magnificent. And again, it could be considered an intimate space, but there's an epic quality to its intimacy, and it's such a magnificent architectural gem.
Robert Stacy Judd, the architect, is a topic all on his own. That dude was amazing and a little wild. Let's see. What topics in the secret teachings did you find most intriguing? You might have addressed that, but go ahead.
I touched on that. I would say again, the chapters on Pythagoras, chapters on sacred geometry, the chapters on Native American tradition, because so much of that was neglected at the time. Those are among the most intriguing for me.
Okay. And I have a question about your own take on quantum spirituality.
Wow. Well, we could do a whole evening on that, and perhaps we will. I do think that there are really serious questions about the nonlinear nature of time, the fluidity of material, the impact of perspective on experience that are being raised in quantum theory, that are being raised in string theory, that are being raised in serious psychical research, that are even being raised in some of the most advanced experiments that are being done in the placebo response today. And I think, and I won't go into this, in any length, because it's a whole subject area into itself. But I think that our generation might be poised on a reconsideration of human nature that's as great as the reconsideration of human nature that the theories of Darwin visited upon the Victorian generation. I don't think materialism as a philosophy holds up anymore. Philosophical materialism is basically the belief that matter creates itself. Matter creates itself. A law, to be a law, has to be consistent, and there are inconsistencies in materialism. The field of neuroplasticity alone, which is not controversial, challenges materialism because it demonstrates that sustained thought influences the cellular matter of the brain. Sustained thought influences the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in the brain. So, it begs the question, what is thought? If thought is an epiphenomenon of the brain, then how is it actually creating the matter out of which it arises? I don't think materialism is going to linger with us for a very long time, but I think that it's inconsistent. It no longer occupies or ought to occupy a place of primacy in Western thought. And there are just so many changes I think our generation is poised upon. I do have a talk. There's a talk I delivered at PRS called Hermes Resurrected. Another talk called Reclaiming the Damned, which is about UFO phenomena. And I go further into quantum theory and the questions that arise from it in those talks. And those are up on YouTube.
Indeed. Thank you for mentioning that, Mitch. Our YouTube channel is very rich, and it includes a whole playlist of Mitch Horowitz when he was here. One of my favorite lectures is the one on women esoteric leaders, which is...
Right, Rebel Spirits. Yeah, that's a favorite of mine, too.
Yes. So I'm going to forgive me if I don't get to all the questions here. Here's one that I skipped before. Should we read your book or Manly's first?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say do whatever passion moves you to do. There's no wrong answer. I think reading mine first will be helpful. But if you've already read Manly's book and you want to re-enter it, mine might be a nice brush up, and then you could re-enter Manly. You might want to read them at the same time. You might want to read, my book hand in hand as a companion when you get to the pertinent chapters. So I don't think you can go wrong. When you're following your passions of discovery, you're always brought to the right place, in my view.
Here's an interesting question, Mitch, which you can pass on if you want, but it's a little bit confessional. You talk about the challenges Manly may have had facing his own body of work later in his life, perhaps feeling that he peaked early. You face his work every day. What personal challenges do you confront continuing to expand upon this work? And we should say other work like Neville Goddard. Yeah.
Sure. Well, the challenges I face are how to write about these topics and these ideas for a mainstream audience without getting caught in the cycle of trying to make them relevant in some way that that pegs these ideas to current events or something like that. It's very, very difficult to write for mainstream publications about these ideas without some sort of like a news peg or something like that. And I really, really resist that. I resist sensationalism. I resist the impulse to take things in a direction that appeals to the lowest denominator or the perceived lowest denominator of people's interests. You know, one of the great difficulties in publishing today is this misperception that if you reduce the fineness of something philosophically, if you reduce the quality of something, if you reduce the detail that you bring, you'll get more readers. And I don't believe that's true at all. I've never seen any research to that effect. I've never seen any numbers, you know, to back that up. But there's a persistent belief that, you know, you have to kind of like reduce things to bold-faced names, treat the reader not as a colleague, but almost as a child who needs to be spoon-fed sensation. And I resist that. I resist that. And I don't think it's valid. Readers, by definition, are a self-selected group of our culture that care about learning. And I want very much to package these ideas, to present these ideas in a way that brings dignity to them. That brings me the greatest joy. So, you know, I'm always resisting that current and that urging, which does get directed at me sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. You and we here at PRS have a terrible business model.
Yeah.
We're always pointing to, look over there, you know, at these, and these ways other people have made me. All right. We have a question about to what extent do we know that Hall's work was grounded in scholarship? But I think your book answers that question on every page, just about.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would add this. I mean, I believe, you know, and I alluded to this earlier. Some of Manly's scholarship is really fine and impeccable. Some of it, I think, particularly later in life, was overly dependent maybe on a single source. I think sometimes he didn't peel back the onion far enough to question the bibliographical legitimacy of material that might have been passed on to him, such as the idea of there being a mysterious, inspiring figure at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, something I write about in the book. So, you know, again, I don't think we do ourselves any favors. I don't think we do proper credit and honor to the life of this great man to exclude him from criticism. I wouldn't want to be excluded from criticism. So I take up some of that in the book.
Very good. Interesting question. Did Manly have a near-death experience or serious illness in his younger years? I know he did as he aged, but do you know about that?
There's a story that is circulated. I'm not sure whether it's ever been verified that Manly, as a child, had a near-death experience, and some people interpreted that to mean that he underwent some sort of a reincarnation experience, and that there was a daemon which occupied him. This is obviously very fanciful, that allowed him to produce this prodigious work at such a young age. You know, but this is kind of folklore, and I don't think it's ever been verified. But that's one of the stories that gets circulated.
Okay. Just scrolling through here. Really nice comments. Was Manly P. Hall a Freemason or a Rosicrucian?
Manly was a Freemason. He joined Freemasonry later in life. He joined Freemasonry in the 1950s when he was in early middle age. He died with the 33rd honorable degree in Freemasonry, which is considered, you know, in some annals of Masonry to be the highest of all degrees. You know, it's a tough question to respond to, you know, as to whether Manly was a Rosicrucian, because what we have of Rosicrucianism, and I read about this in the Seeker's Guide, are manuscripts that are certainly very real and possessed of a philosophy, and were very influential. We don't really know whether Rosicrucianism was an actual hidden society or whether it was a small number of provocateurs. There are lots of organizations that claim lineage to Rosicrucianism, but again, it's a tricky thing to claim lineage to something that we don't really know the nature or the shape of. You know, Rosicrucianism was certainly a thought movement, and we have writings to demonstrate that. Whether it was an actual fraternity, we don't know. And I think Manly felt some of that skepticism himself when he came out to Los Angeles as a young man in his early 20s. He fell in with the Rosicrucian Fellowship and some different Rosicrucian orders, and he fostered very important and significant personal relationships at these places, particularly Max Heindel's Rosicrucian Fellowship. But he came to doubt their claims to historical lineage. So I wouldn't describe him as Rosicrucian, but he certainly was a Freemason. And it's interesting, you know, he didn't join Masonry until many years after the Secret Teachings.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Here's a compliment, which we're going to read here. Thank you so much for sitting with us. I find myself very much in the position that you described 20 years ago, just beginning my immersion in esoterica and accessing it first through these personalities. I want to thank you for being that towering personality for me and for being such a grounded, ethical, and generous seeker and teacher.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. I try. And, it's the privilege of my life and it's the joy of my life to work with this material. And there's something I always like to point out to people. I didn't publish my first book until I was over the age of 40. I'm turning 55 next month. November 23rd will be my 55th birthday. And I think I published Occult America when I was, I don't know, maybe about 43, something like that. So I always want to kind of get it across to people that, you know, doing this work, it is truly the culmination of a dream for me. It's such a privilege. But I didn't find my way to it until I was in what people would consider to be middle age. And I really want people to know that, you know, life can take turns and prove itself flexible at times and at moments where conventionally people think, oh, you're just settling down, you're settling into a certain groove. But for me, you know, it all didn't begin until I was past the age of 40. So I like to remind people of that.
Excellent. And then the question from the same commenter. On the subject of ethics, as I begin my own immersion, I've been wrestling with the question of appropriation. So glad you asked this question. Mm-hmm. Mickey Hall's work acts as a codex, a curation of spirituality's esoteric faiths and practices, all various paths toward accessing a deeper universal truth. Mm-hmm. So many spiritual beliefs and practices that I feel are of great benefit to all beings come from cultures that have been oppressed, sometimes specifically their religious practices, indigenous, etc. How does one approach stitching together a patchwork of their own codex of all these practices while still being a respectful and conscientious ally? What a wonderful question. And before you answer, Mitch, let me just say that the last lectures series I did in the auditorium before everything went to hell was Native American Wisdom. Mm-hmm. And that is Voices of Native American Wisdom, and that is my scholarly area. So I get into that a lot in those lectures on YouTube. Mm-hmm. But thank you for that incredibly important question.
Yeah, it's a huge question for us today, particularly as there's this porous nature to life that we've never experienced before, where, you know, things come down to us that our ancestors didn't possess. You know, the first English translation of the great Chinese ethical work, the Tao Te Ching, didn't even appear until 1838. You know, when Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing his essays in the early to mid 1840s, there was probably just maybe 5 English language versions of the Bhagavad Gita at that time in the United States. You know, today, I mean, you just log in any old time and, take your pick of translations, maybe good, bad, somewhere in the middle of the Gita, the Tao, and all kinds of ancient ethical and religious works. I think that one has to have a very deep grounding in history. I think that it's profoundly important to understand the ground that you're standing on, the people who have occupied that ground, the cultural circumstances. It is also important to understand that religious history throughout the arc of human history has always been syncretic, has always been combinative. People have always borrowed things, reworked things. I mean, look, Saul of Tarsus, became St. Paul, converting from, a Jew to proto-Christian, so there are always these changes afoot in the life of the individual when confronting different ideas. I was asked about this question just the other night. I was doing a presentation with Atlas Obscura, and I was making reference to the African-American tradition of Hoodoo, which is a tradition that I care very, very deeply about, and that does represent a personal commitment in my life. And I was asked, how do you approach that? This is a tradition that was fostered centuries ago by embondaged people. And how do you participate in that in an authentic way and in a way that has integrity? And that's not just this act of kind of clipping and pasting. And it's a wonderful question. I'm always consciously aware of the cultural circumstances in which I'm approaching these practices. And I see it as my privilege to be able to approach these practices. I approach them on bended knee and with the deepest respect. I don't go around appropriating names or titles or, appending things to my name so as to pretend that I'm somehow part of something, that I'm not. But at the same time, I feel strongly that we have to be really patient too with people's experiments, because it's a part of religious history. I remember years ago, I was seated in some macrobiotic restaurant in New York City, downtown, and I heard some guys at the next table who I recognized as guys who were part of a local yoga studio talking about how on Thursday nights at their yoga studio, they had a prayer circle to Ganesha, the great Indian god, the great Vedic god, who is thought to lower barriers. And I'd say, as I was sitting there, I thought to myself at first, who do these, New Agers think they are? They're not real Hindus, these guys, with their ceremony Thursday night to Ganesha, it's just a bunch of, kind of casual, I don't know, I don't think I thought in terms of appropriation at the time, but, I just thought it was a bunch of, kind of casual hoo-ha. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, hang on. For all I know, these guys may find something. They may find something very valuable. They may come to a new sensibility as to how 21st century people can approach ancient deities, engage with Vedic deities. If I rush in and want to say, these New Age guys, what do they know? I'm stifling what could be an extraordinary experiment, what could produce something meaningful in their lives, and then they could pass that on to another person. And next thing you know, we have a new way of engaging ancient ideas. So I'm very cognizant of the respectfulness and the historicism that a person should be grounded in, but at the same time, I'm also really, really encouraging of experiment. I think that's been the wellspring of our entire religious existence.
I'll echo that myself. When I first started doing Native American studies, I made a lot of mistakes. For example, I cited a pretendian, as they call them, someone who was writing as a Native person and wasn't. And I got fooled by it. And someone could have come along and did what was in your head there, Mitch, and just shut me down, and I would have been done. Right. So you just keep listening, you just keep moving and you keep listening. And fortunately, someone talked to me and said, hey, you really shouldn't do that with this writer. And that kept me going on that path whereas
Yeah.
otherwise I would have been stopped and the whole world opened up to me. All right, Mitch, let's get this over with. You've been waiting for this question. Are you a Satanist?
What a wonderful question. I believe in giving direct answers to direct questions, so I'm going to give you a very direct answer. And the answer is yes. However, I also want to give you a very clear answer. And the clearer answer is that I have my own individualized conception of what that means. And it's very important to understand that it's impossible to interpret another person's ethical and religious and spiritual journey through the lens of decisions that other people have made about what a classification is, what a thought system is, what a school is, or through entertainment. You know, we have to be able to define our terms or wind up defining one another into these very narrow corners and spaces. To me personally, and I write about this extensively in a series of articles on the website Medium, for example, under the heading of God of the Outsiders, also the title of a lecture that I was very privileged to deliver at PRS and that you can find up on YouTube. I believe that we can attempt a very legitimate esoteric reading of a satanic tradition in the West that understands the satanic not as a force of evil or violence or maleficence, but as a force of radical individualism, usurpation, radical nonconformity, revolutionary change, extolling of the individual. I believe that if Adam and Eve had not mythically eaten from the so-called tree of knowledge of good and evil, humanity wouldn't be itself. We would be incapable of having this exchange right now. They needed to break out of the so-called paradisical world in which they were kept and to venture out into a world of friction and difficulty, because friction is the price of creativity. I mean, without friction, we would remain emotional and intellectual children. Now, I take a very radical stance and radical position, and there are people who have come to me and they have said, you know, quite legitimately and quite fairly, I groove to everything that you're talking about, but do you have to use the term Satan? Do you have to use that language? And they have a point. They have a legitimate point, because I am not in this business to provoke or to push buttons or to, you know, just kind of create heat. But I also have to be really, really frank and really straightforward about the nature of my search, or my search is dead. You know, my work and my search are the same thing. And as I said, I will sometimes find my way to ideas, very often, through a certain person and a certain historical idea. And I began to ask questions about this mythical persona of Satan. Although I don't just view the satanic as metaphorical, I do feel that there are deific energies with which we can foster relationships. And I think that represents the most misunderstood of those deific presences in Western life. And I'm attempting, certainly in my own life and in my writing, to bring a new conception to that idea. So I hope that adequately answers your question.
Mitch, when I hear you answer that question, voices come into my mind. John Milton, William Blake.
Yes.
William James, even. Does that sound right?
Oh, absolutely, without question. Blake and Milton are probably my two greatest sources of inspiration. There are other modern sources of inspiration. Michael Aquino, Anton LaVey. I don't embrace everything that they're about, but they have been sources of inspiration to me. I think they demonstrated elements of brilliance that certainly helped me. But my search is entirely my own.
Yeah. Max Heindel, any influence on you?
No personal influence on me. I tend not to go in for. Look, again, I believe we need to be very patient with one another in terms of the labels and the terms that we claim. I was just describing a very controversial one. I personally don't feel that the lineage of Rosicrucianism has a legitimate historical expression in the modern West today, because we don't understand Rosicrucianism at its roots entirely. It was a thought movement. I'm referring to this because Max Heindel was the head of the so-called Rosicrucian Fellowship in Southern California for many years. And so because we don't fully understand Rosicrucianism as a thought movement, it's difficult to speak of it as a contemporary movement, that harkens back to some sort of lineage. At the same time, look, Max Heindel assembled a wonderful library, assembled resources and spaces where young individual seekers could come and find themselves, one of whom was Manly P. Hall. And Manly had a close relationship with Heindel and with Heindel's wife. And for a while, I think they were kind of surrogate parents to him. So I think his encounter with Max Heindel was wonderful, and I think it brought a lot of good things to his life. I think Heindel was a really distinct individual, valuable individual, even though, I have my questions about the use of the term Rosicrucianism today.
Mitch, I almost hate to do this. We've had such a lovely conversation, but do you have anything to say about the political state of America?
Look, if I had any wisdom to offer about politics, I assure you I would share it. I have made a personal decision. I'm not saying this is for everybody. I'm not saying it's appropriate for everybody. I have personally decided to stop posting about politics on social media maybe about 8 or 9 months ago, particularly on Twitter. It's a terrible morass. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't accomplish anything. I frankly have been a lot happier and a lot more relaxed since I made that decision. I'm not saying it's for everyone. There are people who are journalists and it's their living to post about politics. There are people who make their living on opinion journalism, and that's what they do. There are people who are organizing activities and events, and that's what they do. I think anybody who knows me has a pretty good idea of what my political outlook is. And again, I'm not saying that my decision is right for everybody, but I will tell you that ceasing to post about politics has been a very positive thing in my life, and I don't think I was accomplishing anything by posting politically. So I just offer that as a personal anecdote.
Yeah, right. All right, any last questions? We have a quote from Frank Zappa. Politics, the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex.
Right. Oh, there's so many wonderful questions. I mean, people are asking, am I in favor of a new world order? Yes. And what can I say about Rudolf Steiner? There are so many questions that we could spend a whole night on, and I'd love to come back and do this. I'm just heartened by the number of people who are here and all the wonderful questions. I wish we could get to every one of them, but we'll come back together.
How can we reach you in the future for interviews or follow-ups? MitchHorowitz.com?
Well, my website is MitchHorowitz.com, and believe it or not, the email that you'll find on my website is my real email. It's the one that everybody uses. It's not some crank account that I never check. It's the real thing. And I'm often asked, how can you put your real email up online? Aren't all these, crazy people going to come after you? Very, very little. You'd be surprised. I get almost no hate mail, almost none. And I think there's it's kind of weird, isn't it? There's some inverse relationship to making yourself available and to, haters. It's almost like, I don't know, you'd think that people would be beating a path to my door, to complain about this and that. But most of the notes I get are actually very encouraging, very positive, very specific. I try to write back to everybody. I ask only for brevity, just because logistically, it's the only thing that makes it work. So if there's a request, if there's a question, whatever, I really try to respond. I just ask for brevity. The other way to reach me, and probably the best way, is through social media. I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz. And if you don't like politics, good, join my page because I don't post about politics. And Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. So Twitter at Mitch Horowitz, Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. I stay, I'm really current at all those places. And again, my website, mitchhorowitz.com.
Mitch, I want to thank you and echo what you said. For a person who's doing so much and speaking to so many people, you're remarkably accessible, and I think that's an amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we appreciate all you've done for PRS over the years, and especially with this book, which helps PRS as well as Mitch Horowitz. So thank you again, Mitch. You've been a great friend to PRS and to Mr. Hall's legacy. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And yes, go ahead.
Back at you. No, back at you. It's a great privilege. It's engaging with PRS, engaging with secret teachings. It's been one of the joys of my life. It's a great privilege, and I'm grateful to you all for being with us tonight.
I hope I can see you soon, and we'll get you some Lucifer's pizza.
Yes, right on. I miss it.
With our favorite pizza joint right down the street.
It's really good.
I see Mitch can do a whole pizza all himself.
Right.
Which is another amazing fact of Mitch Horowitz. Yes, I see a question about recording. I am recording this. I will edit it and put it up. And the book is available at PRS online. We'll have some more stock in Tuesday. It's available other places too, like a little site called bookshop.org that is for independent bookstores like ours. And then there may be another place to buy a book. I don't know, but we want.
Struggling little startup somewhere out there. Yeah. So, right.
We appreciate you all. PRS is here to continue Manly Hall's mission. It remains unchanged because it's brilliant. We're not going to pick a path for you. We're going to provide you resources for the path you're on, and everybody's on a path. And so we're going to be here throughout this pandemic to help you on your path. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Mitch.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Pleasure.